We have Dylan Horrocks.
That's right. We actually sat down with Dylan 2 years ago.
2 years ago. This
Wait,
interview.
1 year ago in 2021, in the lead up to the ComicFest that we were going to have in real life. It was only 1 year ago, but it feels like 2 years ago because time is not linear anymore. And we talked to him about his love of comics. He is a teacher of comics at Victoria University, and he also is an amazing comic artist. So we'll cross over to the interview that we did to him now, if we can. Yes,
Hi, I'm Dylan Horrocks, and I'm a cartoonist. I've been drawing graphic novels for a long time. And now I'm also lecturing at the Victoria University of Wellington School of Design Innovation. Comics are kind of my original language for storytelling. I feel like when I was growing up, I was reading comics before I could even read words. So for me, I love drawing them because it allows me to use the entire language, words and pictures, everything that I want to do. And reading them, it feels like it takes me right inside the mind of the person who's telling me a story. Sam Zabel is a character that I've been drawing for decades, and he kind of started out as a way for me to tell stories about cartooning, about being a cartoonist. And over time he turned into a kind of avatar, like you use in a video game or a role-playing game. And I would, if I was trying to work something out in my own life, or some big question I had as a cartoonist or just as a human being, I would take Sam and I'd put him in situations a bit like what I was facing. And then I'd just see what he did. He was like a lab rat. I'd kind of crank things up, make them a bit more intense. And he wouldn't always make the same choices I would make, and that was really interesting and helpful for me. So my last graphic novel, Sam Zabel and the Magic Pen, throws him into a crazy situation where he's travelling inside comics and exploring the fantasy worlds that he finds inside. And it was my way of working through some issues I was having with stories. Yeah, Hicksville, I started working on Hicksville when I was living in the UK, and I missed New Zealand terribly. And it was a way of processing my relationship with New Zealand initially, by creating a kind of imaginary utopia for myself within New Zealand. And then I continued working on it after returning to New Zealand. It became something slightly different. I guess I was using it partly to work through questions I had about what this country meant to me in terms of a place to stand in the world. And the way I always like to think of it is that the world is not a circle with a centre. The world is a globe, and wherever you stand on that globe is to you the centre of the circle. And I wanted to position myself in New Zealand and then look out at the world and say, well, what does the world look like to me from here? But it was also me working out my relationship with comics in the wider world of art and literature. And comics tends to be seen as on the edge of art and literature in the same way that New Zealand tends to be seen as the edge of the world. And so I was trying to do that for comics as well. I was trying to say, well, what do we see if we position ourselves with comics as the centre of the world of art and the world of writing? How does the rest of the world look when we take that as the absolute centre? Whereas with the Magic Pen, I think what I was trying to work out there was my relationship with imaginary worlds, imaginary places, because I guess I've spent a lot of my life living both in New Zealand, but also living in these completely imaginary places and imaginary worlds. The ones I make up and the ones that I encounter in other people's stories. And I love having that other life in imaginary places. But increasingly, I was starting to wonder about the kind of moral dimensions that we bring to those fantasy worlds and that we process through those fantasy worlds, the questions we're trying to answer, and the fantasies that we indulge in those worlds. And I guess the question that was at the heart of that book was, do we bear a moral responsibility for our fantasies? And I didn't know the answer. So I I did the book as a way of trying to find my way to an answer.
Do you know the answer now?
Spoiler alert. I'd say that usually when I set out to answer a question with a story or a book, I end up with more questions. But they're new and fresh questions that seem more exciting. I guess with the magic pen, there's a reason why I open the book with two quotes. And one of them is from Yeats, and it's the line, "In dreams begins responsibility." And I get that. I think there's something very true about that. The daydreams, the fantasies, the speculations we have is part of how we start the journey towards a sense of responsibility of what we believe and what we value. But the other quote is from a porn performer and producer who's also written about pornography a lot. She's studied it and taught about it, Nina Hartley. And she says, I'll probably paraphrasing now from memory. I should know my own book. But she says, our fantasies have no moral weight. And the full quote that comes from is she's saying what we do has moral weight, and what we say has moral weight, the things that we do in the real world do. But what goes on inside our heads, that doesn't have moral weight. We need to be free to explore those questions, even if it takes us into strange and disturbing places that we wouldn't want to share with other people, in order to process stuff. And I felt like both of those things were true. And in a way, the book was an attempt to explore the space between those positions, because I kind of think we all live in that space between those two positions, whether we realise it or not. So I don't know if that's an answer, but
It's definitely an answer.
I think often the way I view everything really when it comes to writing and drawing and making art is that I'm kind of trying to map a landscape, and it might be an internal landscape. I'm just trying to find my way, trying to find a better sense of that landscape so that I don't get so lost. and in a way, that's what Magic Pen was. I was trying to map that territory. At various times, I've tried to do comics differently. I guess I'm never settled, and that's partly because I never feel entirely confident about what I'm doing. So I'm always, and sometimes I've really thrown everything out and said I just need to start from scratch and try a completely different approach. And I study all these other cartoonists who I admire and think, I want to work like them because their books are so much better than mine. And then I spend a couple of years doing that and trying, and eventually I always hit a dead end and decide I need to go back to where I started, to where I've always worked from. And I just go back to the pens I used to use, the same process that I've always used, because that feels like a comfortable place for me. But when I do that, I find that my process has changed a bit. Like, I have learned by exploring how other people do it. So it has definitely changed over the years quite a lot. And recently it changed quite a bit, because I started for the first time ever drawing a comic digitally. And that was, I'd tried before and I thought, this is not for me. But this time I sort of persisted and I realised, this is actually great. I like this. So I'll see how that goes. It's not finished yet, so I may give up and return to paper. But it wasn't as different as I had thought it might be. That was the key thing that made it feel doable. In fact, the big thing that got me excited about it was that it was penciling on it. And I found penciling on, I was using an iPad Pro with Clip Studio, and I found penciling was really comfortable and easy on that. And then I started to feel like, well, maybe I should start exploring different ways of inking on there from what I've normally done. And so I'm trying out inking with more of a pencil-like tool on the iPad rather than with a brush-like tool. I know it's still technically brush in Clip Studio, but something that has more of the texture and feel and look of a really dark pencil or even charcoal. Because I've never liked my inking very much. But yeah, it's also possible that 6 months from now we're just like, no, this is another dead end. I need to go back to what I've always done. So we'll see.
And then you'll have to go back to where am I now?
Exactly. I gotta say that at the moment, what excites me most about New Zealand comics is that I cannot keep up. There's just so much happening, and there are so many comics communities now in New Zealand. And I mean, it used to be, if you got to know a couple of people from Christchurch and a couple of people from Wellington, and a couple of people from Auckland and Hamilton, you know, if you just sort of, you'd discover the little pockets of people doing those things, and that was kind of it. And it wasn't that hard to keep up with stuff. But it's quite common now that I come across a graphic novel I had no idea existed. It's amazing. And I'm like, who is this person? I don't know. And yeah, and you know, with webcomics it's even more so. There's stuff coming out all the time from all over. And the other thing is the sheer diversity of the kind of work that's coming out. There's such a range of different voices now. People from all kinds of cultural backgrounds, with all kinds of experiences and so on, and exploring their lives and exploring the kind of daydreams they have. And yeah, it's exploding. I can't keep up. So events like ComicFest are actually really one of the things I love about it. Is I get to meet other people making stuff, and sometimes it's old friends, and sometimes it's people I didn't realise were making comics. But also, I'll just be chatting to someone who's come along for the day to see what's happening, and it turns out, you know, they have been drawing comics, and they reluctantly show me, and often they're wonderful. And so it's just it's a chance for people to come together and discover each other. One of the things I'm really enjoying at the moment about teaching at Vic is that we have students come through whose work absolutely knocks my socks off. So one of our former students, Liliana Magneto-Quick, is now doing a regular strip for the spin-off about eating in Wellington, subject close to my heart. And she takes every opportunity to make it into a really interesting piece of cartooning. She plays with the form, she uses scrolling in interesting ways. But lots of other students too. I don't know if they would feel comfortable having me name some of them. But I want them to put all their comics online. I think comics somehow have found themselves in just the right place at just the right moment to be a form that people are drawn to because of its freedom. Somehow, I think the fact that comics are something you can do with no money. I don't really know entirely what it is. I think it's also that comics have always sat slightly outside of the official literary world. I don't know. I mean, there's a really long history. There have been queer cartoonists for as long as there have been comics. There have been refugee voices in comics. There have been migrant voices. All sorts of people have made one of the earliest graphic novels, possibly the earliest graphic novel made in America, was by a Japanese migrant who had found their way to the US, and they were feeling very out of place, and they made a manga about the experiences in the 1920s. You know, it's only recently been reprinted after all those years. But I think that kind of reveals something about how comics have been used by people who weren't necessarily being given a voice in other spaces. But right now, I guess across all media, there's been a massive cultural shift happening. And thank God, I mean, it's better late than never. And there's pushback, even in comics, there are people who don't appreciate that there is now a diversity of voices and views. But to me, this is absolutely a golden age for comics. It's the most exciting time to be making comics, certainly that I've ever seen.